Appropriately enough, there are many roads to travel to get to Dark City. These little paths joining up, swelling, becoming huge highways, all bringing us to a different entry point to this place. There was the dawn of a new era in comic books in the mid-'80s, now referred to with some derision as the Dark Age, because books took on a, darker tone to them. Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, which contributed substantially to the image of Batman as a reinvention for the modern times, that would influence Tim Burton's film adaptation, which forever changed the character from camp to cool, despite Joel Schumacher's best efforts to the contrary. And in the time for the build-up to that film, comics such as Black Orchid, Sandman, and The Crow emerged. Dark comics, more in keeping of indie publishers than one of the big two, which allowed these styles of stories to reach a much larger audience that had previously associated the media with superheroes. In literature, a new form of science fiction began to emerge even earlier, cyberpunk, which rejected both technophobia and technophilia for a middle-of-the-road, technology is here and can be a friend or an enemy approach. And with the influence of the recent Blade Runner, the idea of technology being street-level emerged. And while the inevitable backlash against it might have tarnished the name, the influence of the work in films was notable. But one thing in particular comes to mind, and that goes all the way back to William Gibson's Neuromancer, which most would really consider what started it all, and its concept of storing the human consciousness in technology. So it comes as no surprise that as technology was becoming so powerful that the idea of even joining with us seemed possible, the question of what that could mean would begin to emerge. The 13th Floor in The Matrix asked how you could know if the world around you was real or merely a simulation. Can technology become so pervasive in our reality that it finally becomes our reality in a literal sense? It was 1991 when Alex Proyas first started working on Dark City, and he was making neither cyberpunk nor a comic book film. Proyas had spent the 80s working on commercials and doing music videos before his first feature film, the science fiction tale Spirits of the Air, Gremlins of the Clouds. But it was his next film that would establish him, and that was a comic book adaptation, 1994's The Crow, which was lauded for its visual style and action, producing a dark work that drew comparisons to Blade Runner and Burton's Batman. And there was great interest in what he'd do for his next project, which gave him the opportunity to push for Dark City. Proyas continued to sculpt his script, which complemented his visual style greatly. And as a Greek born in Egypt, raised in Australia, and working in the United States, obviously his influence was the Germans. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which of course is synonymous with German Expressionism, can be seen in this film, alongside the influence of the works of Fritz Lang like Metropolis and M. Kiefer Sutherland even plays the role like Peter Lorre in M. Also, the French-German-Spanish film The City of Lost Children, with the man who steals dreams because he cannot, helped to further shape Proyas' vision. One of the biggest influences, though, was a book by Daniel Paul Schraber. See, Schraber's father had come up with a number of harsh but necessary techniques for raising children that he wrote down, which included immersion in ice water starting at 3 months of age, chest-tightening restraints to ensure proper posture at the dinner table, and other cases of tough love that seemed a little imbalanced between tough and love, as Schraber's older brother killed himself in his 30s. Daniel, on the other hand, started having the impulse to experience sex as a woman, and while it has been argued that this is merely a case of gender dysphoria, since he also believed that he might be transforming into a woman, it's hard to really say because these were connected to things that are definitively nuts. He thought his impulse to experience sex as a woman was being caused by a hypnotist invading his mind and planting those thoughts inside him, and that his transformation was an attempt by no less than God himself, who was also sending tiny men to torture him. In other words, it's hard to say whether something is a healthy condition twisted through a lens of madness, or merely one more aspect of the madness, any more than if you obsess over feet because Martians are making you study them for their invasion plans, you could simply have a foot fetish, Or it could just be one more aspect of your psychotic delusion. Who's to say? I'm not even sure Schreiber himself could. And not for lack of introspection, because he wrote down his own reflections on his psychoses while he was hospitalized, contained in a book called Memoirs of My Nervous Illness. These writings, which some have described as schizophrenic, contributed to the idea behind Proyas' work, which explored that same issue as cyberpunk did of technology making your reality, but with the twist that it was not high-tech virtual reality that tricked your mind. The reality was very much real. Those buildings and streets and photos existed. No, the thing that was being altered was your mind itself, and the technology would be low-tech, a syringe to the brain. Proyas acknowledged this influence by naming Sutherland's character Schreiber. To work on polishing the script, he first brought on Lem Dobbs, whose previous film script seems a rather obvious connection to this film. It was called Kafka, but it was not a mere biopic. It was a film that actually was Kafkaesque in its storytelling. So combined with Proyas' own approach, things were hardly going to move in a more mainstream direction. And so one of the studios, part of the Disney family actually, that was considering backing this asked David S. Goyes to, quote, make it less weird. Goyer had worked with Disney to help finish up The Puppet Master and wrote the script for Disney's Miramax and Dimension films on the sequel to The Crow. And Goyer would of course go on to be known for his work with Christopher Nolan on the Dark Knight trilogy, and also his work at the same time as Dark City was going on, another comic book adaptation straight from the Dark Age, Blade. So Goyer's experience meshed well with Proyas' ideas while bringing in a bit of a different approach. Despite some reservations, this did seem the right time for such a film. The dark world of what many would consider cyberpunk and comics were prominent throughout the 90s films, and Dark City, as a dark science fiction film, seemed like it would fit in well with all of that. And it got a slightly larger budget than The Crow had, but still that film had not been celebrated for its plot and characterization, and even with Dobbs and Goyer, Dark City was still on the weird side, which made the studio very nervous. Keep in mind that this was not long after the box office disaster of Waterworld, which, while generally not considered outright terrible on its own merits, it was nevertheless a train wreck for Universal because it was unable to earn back its enormous budget and became synonymous with Hollywood flops to the point where few, if anyone, hears the name Waterworld and doesn't think, oh yeah, that massive failure. So when Dark City tested badly, the studio gave a note that was literally, dumb it down. Hence the significant difference between the theatrical cut and the director's cut, which I'll be covering today. The theatrical cut not only included an opening narration that explained the premise, but was done by Kiefer Sutherland, and thus giving the impression that he's the protagonist when in reality, he's not. He's an important character, but his part is not terribly large. It's likely that he was chosen because he is the primary source of exposition in the film, although that itself is problematic considering his performance. The most dialogue is given to the person with the creepiest voice. I think it speaks of the problem that fans and creators of speculative fiction have in that the fantastic, which is what separates SF from other works, costs money. By comparison, Memento, which came out a mere 2 years later and likewise played with the mind, it was a film that would leave you confused early on as to what was happening, and yet that film was made for only $5 million versus the $27 million that was needed for Dark City, because you didn't need all of the fantastic stuff that was integral to Dark City. But the film couldn't be done without it. I'll get more into that topic of how science fiction and the blockbuster have become synonymous, and when it comes out it'll be pretty obvious. But for now, the point being that films like Dark City that experimented with things unique to the SF genre that didn't involve mass market elements, well, they ran a significant risk. It may not be the 50s era like It, the Terror from Beyond Space, but the same issue of not losing your shirt on a film still applies. And to be fair to New Line, Proyas wasn't dragged kicking and screaming into altering the film. While he believed in his vision, he lost confidence in its ability to be a successful film after the disastrous test screening, and made the changes in the hopes that it would fix that. It's not just the studios that have to worry about a flop. Creators don't want their careers destroyed and have to go make dog food commercials. This seemed to make little difference, as the box office release of Dark City wasn't terribly impressive, although the critics raved. Dark City would prove to be a source of inspiration both directly and indirectly, because The Matrix the following year drew influence in some aspects, even using some of the same settings as Dark City. And because of The Matrix's success, further spreading this influence so that Dark City itself might seem a bit mediocre by comparison, because over time its experimental aspects became the new norm in some ways, and joined a legacy of films that said that dumbing it down isn't mandatory for science fiction films, that you can work to bring the same kind of intellect that print science fiction had and put it on the big screen. But how does the film itself come together? Let's take a look at Dark City.